The moment Malcolm Draper realized the young man standing 4 feet from his desk was his own son, the child he had denied, the life he had erased, he did not shout. He did not collapse. He did not reach for his phone or press the intercom or call for his attorney. He just sat there, his hands flat on the surface of a desk that cost more than most people's homes. His breathing changed in a way that no one in the room would have noticed unless they were looking for it. And Noel was looking for it. He had been looking for it for 7 months. Malcolm Draper, the man who had built a $3.4 billion luxury hospitality empire from a single beachfront inn, the man who had never in his adult life been caught without a response, opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Not a word. Not a sound. And for the first time in 19 years, the most powerful man in any room he entered had absolutely no idea what to say. Now I need you to pause for a second. Have you ever looked at someone, really looked at them, and realized that the truth had been standing right in front of you the entire time? That you had been too busy, too proud, or too afraid to see it? That every clue had been there, every sign, every whisper of resemblance, and you had chosen, actively chosen, not to look, because looking would mean admitting something about yourself that you were not ready to face. This is a story about a man who built an empire and destroyed a family in the same breath. A man who told a pregnant woman she was a liar, who erased her from his world to protect his image, who never once in 18 years tried to find out if the child was real. And it is a story about a young man who walked into that empire, not for revenge, not for money, not to burn it down, but to look his father in the eye and decide whether he was worth understanding. What he discovered changed both of their lives. But before we get there, you need to understand how this began. Because the beginning is where the damage was done. 7 months earlier, Chicago, 37th floor of the Draper International Tower. The building itself was a monument to one man's vision, all steel and glass, rising out of the lakefront skyline like a declaration. But the real monument was the corner office at the top, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, Italian marble beneath every step, furniture selected not for comfort but for effect, and a silence so deliberate, so engineered, that it seemed to hum with its own frequency. The kind of silence that says you are here because I allow it. Malcolm Draper sat behind his desk reviewing the 4th revision of a blueprint for a flagship property in Monaco. His pen moved across the page with the same decisive authority that had defined every year of his professional life. He did not tap the pen. He did not pause to think. He marked what was wrong, noted what needed to change, and moved to the next line. That was how he operated. In every room, in every negotiation, in every decision, Malcolm Draper moved forward. Always forward. The concept of looking back was, to him, an indulgence reserved for people who had not built anything worth protecting. He was 61 years old, silver at the temples, sharp-featured, with the kind of posture that communicated authority before he ever opened his mouth. He had built Draper International from nothing. A single beachfront inn purchased at 26 with borrowed money and a business plan scrawled on hotel stationery. That inn became 2. 2 became 6. 6 became a global brand. Luxury resorts across 4 continents, a portfolio that included some of the most exclusive properties on earth. And at the center of all of it, Malcolm, untouchable, unreachable, a man who had turned precision into a religion and isolation into a lifestyle. But here is the thing about men who build walls that high. The walls do not just keep the world out. They keep everything in. And what stays locked inside a man for 19 years does not disappear. It ferments. It waits. It becomes something heavier than he remembers putting there. That morning, Malcolm's assistant of 11 days had quit, the 3rd one that year. The role was impossible by design. Malcolm demanded perfection, not excellence, perfection, and he demanded it without warmth, without encouragement, without the softening language that most leaders learn to deploy. People either survived his orbit, or they did not. Most did not. The replacement arrived at 9:15. He walked in without hesitation, no hovering at the threshold, no nervous glance around the room. He simply entered, stopped 4 feet from the desk, and stood there, still, patient, as if he had been standing in rooms like this his entire life. Malcolm did not look up immediately. He finished his notation on the blueprint, set his pen down with a faint click, and raised his eyes. The young man was maybe 19, lean build, dark hair pushed back cleanly from his forehead. A face that carried an uncommon stillness, not the rehearsed composure of someone managing their nerves, but the natural quiet of a person who had never needed to perform calm because calm was simply where he lived. He wore a navy suit. It was not expensive, but he wore it the way a person wears something chosen with care rather than anxiety. Every detail deliberate, nothing trying too hard. "My last assistant lasted 11 days, Malcolm said. His voice had the texture of granite, smooth on the surface but hard underneath. "Do not be the 12th. "I will not be," the young man said. "Not yes, sir. Not I will do my best. Not thank you for the opportunity." Just 3 words delivered with a certainty that had no business existing in someone that young. Malcolm studied him for a beat longer than he intended. Something flickered at the edge of his awareness, faint, unformed, like catching a scent you recognize but cannot place. He dismissed it the way he dismissed everything that did not serve an immediate purpose. He returned to his blueprint. What Malcolm Draper did not know, what he could not have known, what the world itself had conspired to keep invisible, was that the young man standing 4 feet from his desk was his own flesh and blood. His son, the child he had denied 19 years ago, with the same cold efficiency he applied to a bad contract. The life he had refused to look at because looking would have cost him something he was not willing to pay. The young man's name was Noel Vasquez, but the name on his original birth certificate, the one his mother had never destroyed, only folded carefully and placed inside a fireproof box beneath old photographs and a dried corsage from a night she no longer spoke about, read Noel Draper. Vasquez was not a disguise. It was a declaration. It was the surname of Daniel Vasquez, the man who had married Noel's mother when Noel was 3 years old. A high school guidance counselor in Albuquerque who coached weekend basketball and sang off-key while grilling on the back patio. A man who had never once, not in 16 years, made Noel feel like a borrowed son. Daniel was the man who showed up, the man who stayed, and his name on Noel's documents was not a hiding, it was an honoring. But behind that name, behind the quiet confidence and the careful suit and the steady gaze, there was a wound. There is always a wound, and Noel's wound had a shape. It was shaped like a man who had looked at a photograph of a 3-week-old baby and said, "That is not mine." Noel grew up knowing 2 truths. The first was that his mother, Isabel, was the strongest person he would ever meet. The second was that somewhere in Chicago, behind glass and marble and engineered silence, there was a man who had decided that Noel was not real, who had looked at evidence of his own child and called it a fabrication, who had turned a woman's honesty into a weapon against her and walked away without once turning back. Isabel Cordero, that was her maiden name, before she became Isabel Vasquez, before Albuquerque, before Daniel, before the sage green house and the weekend basketball games and the careful, deliberate life she had built out of nothing. At 23, Isabel had been an event coordinator for one of Malcolm Draper's earliest properties. She was ambitious, talented, sharp in the way that made rooms pay attention without her ever raising her voice. And she had fallen in love with a man who treated her presence like a convenience and her absence like a relief. When she told Malcolm she was pregnant, she expected difficulty. She expected resistance. What she did not expect was annihilation. He denied the child in front of his legal team. He called her a liar in front of his business partners. He implied, publicly, with the kind of quiet cruelty that powerful men have perfected into an art form, that she was a woman of calculation, someone who had seen an opportunity and manufactured a crisis to exploit it. And then he did something worse than denying her. He erased her. A quiet directive ensured that no one in the hospitality industry would work with her. No reference, no recommendation, no door left open. She did not just lose him. She lost her career, her network, her sense of belonging in a world she had worked years to enter. She left Chicago with a suitcase, a pregnancy, and a humiliation so complete that it took her 3 years to say his name out loud without her hands shaking. And then she rebuilt. Not quickly, not cleanly, but completely. She met Daniel at a community center where she had been volunteering to fill the hours that loneliness would have otherwise consumed. He was kind in a way that did not perform itself. He was steady in a way that did not announce itself. He loved her son without condition and without reservation, and together they built a life that was small and ordinary and absolutely extraordinary in its decency. If you have ever known what it feels like to be denied by someone who was supposed to protect you, if you have ever carried a question about your own worth that someone else planted inside you before you were old enough to defend against it, then stay with this story, because what happens next will grip you. But first, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, because stories like this one do not come around often. And this one is just getting started. 7 months before Noel walked into Malcolm Draper's office, he was sitting on the floor of his studio apartment near the University of New Mexico campus. His back against the bed frame, a notebook open across his knees, his laptop on the floor beside him, screen glowing with the Draper International corporate website. He had been researching the company for 5 months. Not obsessively, not frantically, methodically, the way he approached everything in his life, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing himself. He had read every public financial filing. He had studied their expansion patterns across 4 continents. He had watched recordings of Malcolm Draper's keynote addresses and investor presentations going back 15 years. He had mapped guest retention trends across their European portfolio and identified patterns that their own internal data team had apparently missed. He was not preparing for revenge. He was preparing for proximity. His mother arrived that evening carrying a container of pozole and a bag of clean towels. She let herself in with the key he had given her. She set the food on the counter and turned toward him and saw what was on the screen. The color left her face slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Noel had ever heard in that apartment. "No," she said from the doorway. "There is an open position," he said without looking up. "Executive assistant to the CEO, direct access role. The application closes in 3 days." I said, "No, Noel." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Isabel Vasquez had spent 19 years building a wall between her son and that name, that world, that man. Not out of bitterness, though she had earned the right to bitterness 10 times over. Out of protection. She had seen what Malcolm Draper did to people who entered his orbit unprepared. She had lived it. Noel closed the laptop. "Not in surrender. In patience. I am not going there to hurt him," he said. "I am not going to expose him. I am not going to make a scene or file a lawsuit or call a press conference. That is not what this is." "Then what is it, Noel? What could you possibly want from a man who looked at a photograph of you at 3 weeks old and said, 'That is not mine'?" The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Noel let the ripples settle before he spoke. "I want to see him clearly," he said. "Not through your pain. And not through my imagination. I have spent my entire life building a picture of this man, from the things you have told me and the things you have refused to tell me. I want to stand in a room with him and decide for myself what he is." Isabel pressed both palms flat against the kitchen counter and stood like that for a long time, her back to him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He called me a liar," she said, "in front of his lawyers, his partners, his friends. He said I fabricated everything, that I was some ambitious girl trying to claw her way into his money. He made sure no one in that industry would touch me. I had to start over, Noel, completely, from nothing. Do you understand what that cost me?" "I know," he said, "and you built something extraordinary from it. But this is not about him, Mom. This is about me." She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was holding something back by force of will alone. "I am not asking you to trust him," Noel said. "I am asking you to trust me." She did not answer that night. She picked up her keys and left and drove home in silence, and Daniel, who had learned over 16 years exactly when to speak and when to simply be present, said nothing when she walked in. He just set a cup of tea on the table and sat across from her. 3 days later, when the application deadline arrived, Isabel did not call to stop him. That silence was the closest thing to permission she could give. The hiring process for Malcolm Draper's executive assistant was legendary in the industry. 300 applicants were screened. 40 were interviewed by phone. 8 made the final round. Noel's final interview lasted an hour and 15 minutes, nearly double the average. Not because he was aggressive or performative, or trying to impress anyone with charisma, because every answer he gave opened a door the interviewers had not known existed. He identified a 14% decline in repeat guest bookings at properties where general managers had been rotated within the previous 18 months. No one on the panel had flagged that pattern. He connected it to something deeper, something that most data analysts would have missed entirely. "Stability is its own form of luxury," he said quietly. "Your guests are not just purchasing rooms. They are purchasing familiarity, the concierge who remembers their name, the manager who recalls their preferences from a visit 3 years ago. When you rotate leadership too frequently, you erase the thing they came back for. You are not selling geography. You are selling the feeling of being known. The room was silent for several seconds after that. Two of the panelists exchanged a look. The kind of look that says, "Where did this kid come from?" He got the offer on a Wednesday afternoon. When he called his mother to tell her, there was a long pause on the other end. Then she said one thing. "Promise me, if it starts to cost you who you are, you leave. No matter what you have found, no matter what you feel, you leave. I promise," he said. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the house Daniel had painted sage green the summer Noel turned 7. She folded her hands together and pressed them against her mouth and allowed herself for the first time in years to think about the man she had once believed would be part of her son's life, the man who had chosen to be a stranger instead. Day 9. That was when everything shifted. There was a crisis. One of Draper International's flagship properties, a luxury resort on the island of Santorini, had suffered a catastrophic plumbing failure. The East Wing was completely shut down, and in exactly 3 weeks a high-profile wedding was scheduled at that property. 112 guests, $1.2 million in direct revenue, and significantly more than that in brand reputation, because the bride's family had connections to European media and the kind of social influence that could either elevate a brand or bury it. The operations team had been scrambling for 2 days. The conference room was full of senior directors and regional managers, all of them talking over each other, throwing solutions at the wall with the frantic energy of people who knew their jobs depended on the outcome. Fly in a contractor team from Athens, rewrote the entire wedding party to the Mykonos property. Offer a full refund and a future credit. Apologize publicly and control the narrative. Noel had been standing near the back of the room, tablet in hand, logging notes. He had not been asked to contribute. He was there to observe and record. That was his role. That was the boundary. After 20 minutes of circular debate that had produced no consensus and significant frustration, Noel took a single step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not clear his throat or wait for someone to acknowledge him. He simply spoke into the first gap the room offered. "The plumbing failure affects the East Wing," he said. His voice was calm and clear, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stop not because he demanded it, but because the precision of his words created its own gravity. "The West Wing and the Garden Pavilion are fully functional. The wedding party is 112 guests. The pavilion seats 130. If you relocate the event footprint entirely to the West Wing and Pavilion, reinforce the West Wing accommodations for the overnight guests, and bring in mobile luxury. Restroom units, the kind used at high-end outdoor festivals and destination events, you can keep the booking completely intact without moving anyone off the island." He paused. The room was silent. "The bride chose Santorini for a reason," he said. "Do not take that from her. Solve around it." The Sioux leaned back in his chair and looked at Malcolm. Malcolm was not looking at the COO. He was looking at Noel, and the expression on his face was one that very few people in that building had ever seen. It was not surprise exactly. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that occurs when you see someone operate at a frequency you thought was yours alone. "Do it," Malcolm said. "Not to the COO, not to the operations team. To Noel. Coordinate it. Report directly to me." Noel nodded once and left the room. The problem was resolved in 4 days. The wedding went forward. The bride never knew how close it had come to falling apart. Afterward, Malcolm called Noel into his office. "Where did you train?" he asked. "I did not," Noel said. "I studied." "There is a difference." Malcolm almost smiled. He did not, but the line between his brows softened for a fraction of a second, and in the geography of Malcolm Draper's face, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The weeks that followed built something between them that neither of them had language for. Malcolm began relying on Noel beyond scheduling and logistics. He began using him as a sounding board, not openly, not with any admission that he valued the input, but in the quiet, indirect way that powerful men request help without ever using the word. He would leave documents on Noel's desk with no instruction other than, "Tell me what you see." He would hold Noel back after meetings and ask a single question about something that had been said, testing whether Noel had caught the subtext beneath the surface. Noel always had. He could distill a 90-minute board meeting into 3 sentences that captured what actually mattered and discarded everything that did not. He could identify the moment in a negotiation where leverage shifted and name the exact phrase that caused the shift. He had a gift for seeing through the performance of a room to the machinery operating beneath it. But it was not the professional competence that unsettled Malcolm. It was the other things. The things that had no place in a corporate context and yet insisted, absolutely insisted, on being noticed. The way Noel held a pen. Between his second and third fingers, slightly unconventional, exactly the way Malcolm had held one since his first year of college. The way Noel turned his coffee cup handle to the left before drinking. The way he went quiet before delivering a difficult observation, not from hesitation but from respect for the weight of what he was about to say. And the way he stood at windows, always windows, looking out at the skyline the way a man looks at the ocean, not searching for anything specific, just allowing the distance to do its work. Malcolm knew those habits, not because he had cataloged them in another person, because they lived in his own body, in his own muscle memory, in the private architecture of who he was when no one was watching. He did not examine the feeling. He filed it somewhere behind quarterly projections and expansion timelines and the relentless forward motion that had defined his entire adult life. But the feeling did not file neatly. It sat there like a door left slightly ajar in a house he thought he had sealed shut years ago, tapping softly in a draft he could not locate. He started sleeping poorly. His penthouse, the one he had owned for 11 years and had always found sufficient, suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too full of rooms designed for a life he had never bothered to build. Now pause for a second. Malcolm is starting to feel something he cannot explain. Noel is watching a man who might be more complicated than the villain he prepared for. And both of them are running out of room to pretend. If you are feeling the tension building right now, drop a comment below. Tell me, should Noel reveal himself, or should he keep watching? And if you have not hit that like button yet, do it now. Trust me, you want to see where this goes. Let us keep moving. It was a Thursday evening when Noel saw the photograph. He had come back to retrieve a charger he had left in the office. The hallway was empty. The floor was quiet, that particular quiet of a corporate building after hours when the machinery of ambition is paused and only the building itself keeps breathing. The office door was slightly ajar. Light from the desk lamp fell in a narrow band across the carpet. Through the gap, Noel could see Malcolm sitting at his desk, not working, not reviewing documents or taking calls or doing any of the 100 things that normally occupied every minute of his waking life. He was just sitting, and in his hand was a photograph. Small, printed on paper, not displayed on a screen. The edges were soft, worn from years of handling, the kind of wear that comes not from carelessness but from repetition, from being taken out and held and looked at and put away and taken out again, over and over, in the private hours when no one is watching. Malcolm was not studying the photograph. He was holding it. The way you hold something that hurts to look at but hurts worse to put down. Noel stepped back from the door. He waited 30 seconds. Then he knocked. Malcolm looked up. The photograph was already gone, slipped into a desk drawer with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent decades hiding the parts of himself that do not serve the image. The walls were back up. The mask was in place. "Forgot my charger," Noel said. "Take it," Malcolm said. His voice was clipped. Already reconstructed. Already performing. Noel picked up the charger and left. But for 3 days afterward, he could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The man his mother had described, the one who dismantled her credibility with a single press statement, who denied his own child without flinching, who chose empire over everything soft and human. That man did not sit alone in darkened offices holding worn photographs of things he had lost. Or maybe he did. Maybe that was the hardest part. A villain is simple. A villain lets you feel clean, righteous anger. And anger is an easy emotion. It does not ask you to reconsider. It does not require nuance. It does not make you sit with discomfort. But a man carrying grief he caused himself, a man haunted not by what was done to him but by what he did, that man requires something more than anger. He requires reckoning, and reckoning is never clean. Noel had spent his entire life constructing a clear, uncomplicated picture of who Malcolm Draper was. It was easier that way. It was survivable that way. But the man with the photograph in his hand did not fit inside that picture. He was spilling over the edges, and Noel did not yet know what to do with that. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, 700 miles away in Albuquerque, Isabel saw the article. It was an Architectural Digest feature on Draper International's newest resort property. A wide photograph accompanied the piece. Malcolm at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, shoulders back, chin raised, the public face of a man who had spent 40 years perfecting the performance of certainty. And just behind him, slightly to the left, caught mid-thought, half turned away from the camera, was Noel. Isabel stared at the image for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and called her sister. "He looks exactly like him," she said when Marisol picked up. There was a pause on the other end. "He always did, Isa. You know that." I told myself it did not matter, that no one would notice, that I was the only one who knew what to look for. And now I am staring at a photograph where they are standing 3 feet apart, and it is like looking at the same man at 2 different ages. She paused. If I can see it in a magazine photo, Marisol, who else is going to see it? But the fear that kept her awake that night was not about Malcolm discovering the truth. It was about what the truth would do to Noel. She had built her entire life to shield him from this collision, and now he had walked directly into the place she had spent 19 years running from. Not because he was reckless, because he was brave. And bravery, she knew from experience, did not protect you from the cost of what you found. The unraveling did not begin with a confrontation. It began with a file. Malcolm had been conducting a routine internal audit, a review of legacy vendor relationships and archived consulting agreements. His legal team compiled years of documents, hundreds of files, most of them unremarkable. But buried in a stack of old contracts from the early years of the company was a name he had not spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. Isabel Cordero, her maiden name, a brief engagement as an event coordinator for one of his earliest properties. The paperwork was sterile, terminated without cause. No notes, no context, just a name and a date and a silence where the rest of the story should have been. The name detonated something inside him that no amount of professional detachment could contain. He sat with the file open for several minutes. He closed it. He opened it again. He ran the dates. He did the math he had refused to do 19 years ago. And this time, the arithmetic landed somewhere deep in his chest like a fracture he had been walking on for years without acknowledging it. He thought about the boy, the pen, the windows, the coffee cup, the silence that felt inherited rather than learned, the particular quality of stillness that he had recognized from the first day without understanding why. No, he told himself, coincidence. He said it the way a man says I am fine about a wound that is already infected, with the desperate conviction of someone who knows that admitting the truth will require him to become an entirely different person than the one he has spent his whole life constructing. He closed the file. He did not sleep that night. But Monday arrived the way Mondays always do, indifferent to whatever broke inside you over the weekend. And Noel had made a decision. He had spent weeks watching, cataloging every observation, every unguarded moment, every crack in the armor, every flicker of something human behind the performance. He had filed it all away like evidence in a case he had not yet decided to bring to trial. But the watching had reached its limit. He could not learn anything more from the outside. The glass wall between them had given him everything it could. If he was going to decide what Malcolm Draper truly was, not the mogul, not the brand, not the legend, but the man, he needed Malcolm to be unguarded. And the only way to shatter a man's guard was to give him a reason to lower it. He sat in his apartment that evening with his mother's voice in his head, Daniel's steady presence in his memory, the birth certificate in the fireproof box, and the question he had been carrying since he was old enough to understand why his birth certificate and his last name told different stories. Is the man who gave me half my blood capable of being more than the worst thing he ever did? He opened his laptop and began writing the memo. It was a standard quarterly operations briefing, supply chain projections, staffing analytics, market positioning data. Professional, thorough, the kind of document Malcolm would read with his usual efficiency and file without a second thought. Except in the appendix, nested between data tables and vendor assessments, formatted identically to the surrounding material so that only someone reading carefully would catch it, was a single reference. A legal filing from 20 years ago. A paternity claim, dismissed without hearing. It was not a weapon. It was a key, not designed to wound, designed to unlock. Noel had decided that if this man was ever going to be real with him, he first had to be real with himself, and that required the door to be opened from the inside. Noel submitted the memo Tuesday morning and returned to his work, and waited. This is the moment everything changes. Malcolm is about to read that memo, and when he gets to the appendix, 19 years of denial are going to collapse in a single breath. Before we go there, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Send it to someone who understands what it means to carry a question about their own identity. And if you are watching without subscribing, what are you waiting for? Hit that button right now. Because this story is about to break wide open. Malcolm read the memo that evening. He was alone in his office. The building had emptied. The city beyond the windows was shifting into its nighttime version, all light and movement, and the distant hum of a world that never fully stops. He read the operations section. He read the projections. He read the staffing analysis. He reached the appendix. He read the reference. He read it again. His hands went completely still on the desk. Not the deliberate stillness of a man exercising control. The involuntary stillness of a man whose body has received information that his mind has not yet agreed to process. 40 seconds passed. He did not move. He did not blink. He stared at the words on the page and felt the architecture of 19 years of carefully constructed denial begin to fracture, silently, invisibly, like stress cracks spreading through glass before the whole thing gives way. He picked up the phone. His voice was steady when he spoke, but the steadiness cost him something. You could hear it in the spaces between the words, in the half-second pauses where the performance almost slipped. "Noel," he said, "come to my office." Noel walked in and stood where he always stood, 4 feet from the desk, hands at his sides, that impossible, inherited stillness. Malcolm looked at him, not as a CEO examining an employee, not as a powerful man assessing a variable. He looked at him the way a man looks at a mirror he has been avoiding for 19 years and has finally been forced to stand in front of. The jawline, the eyes, the particular quality of silence that this young man carried with him everywhere like a second skin. It was all there. It had always been there. He had simply chosen not to see it, the way he had chosen not to see so many things that threatened the clean, controlled narrative he had built around his life. "Is this what I think it is?" Malcolm said. His voice had changed. The boardroom authority, the granite certainty, the decades of practiced command, all of it was gone. What remained was older, raw, a voice that had been waiting behind the performance for 19 years, trapped beneath layers of ambition and denial, and the particular cowardice of a man who had chosen comfort over truth. Noel held his gaze. You already know the answer. The silence that followed was the loudest thing either of them had ever heard. It filled the room the way water fills a space completely, pressing against every surface, leaving no room for pretense or deflection or escape. Malcolm rose slowly from his chair. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, which was a sensation so foreign to a man who had spent his life standing on solid ground of his own construction that it almost made him sit back down. He moved to the window. That window, the one Noel had always gravitated toward. He placed one hand against the glass and looked out at the city below, 37 floors of distance between himself and the world, and for the first time that distance felt like what it had always been. Isolation, not power. Isolation. When he turned back, something in his face had shifted. Not collapsed, not shattered, just opened. The way a locked door opens when the person behind it finally decides that the cost of hiding has become greater than the fear of being seen. "Your mother," he said. "Isabel." "Yes," Noel said. The word hung between them like a bridge with no railing. Crossable, but only with the acceptance that you might fall. "I told myself she was lying," Malcolm said. His voice cracked. Not dramatically, not performatively, just the small, quiet fracture of a sound being forced through a space that has been sealed shut for too long. "I told myself it was calculated, that she saw an opportunity and manufactured a crisis to exploit it. I told my lawyers. I told my partners. I told myself." He paused. I needed to believe that, because if she was telling the truth, then I was the kind of man who abandons his own child to protect a quarterly earnings report and a public image. Noel watched him without moving. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were doing the work that his face refused to. They were measuring, weighing, deciding. Was it easier? Noel asked. Believing she was lying. Was it easier? The question was not cruel. It carried no venom. It had the same precision Noel applied to every problem he encountered, clean, unadorned, seeking only the truth. But the simplicity of it made it devastating, because it did not allow for deflection. It did not leave room for explanation or context or the kind of elaborate justification that powerful men deploy when they are cornered. It demanded a single, honest answer. Malcolm closed his eyes. Yes, the word cost him something. You could see it leave his body, some last scaffolding of self-justification, some final structural support that had been holding up the version of himself he had presented to the world for 2 decades, quietly collapsed. And what remained was not a titan of industry. It was a man, flawed and frightened, and standing in the full weight of what he had done. "Then you already know what you did," Noel said. There was no shouting in that room. No accusations thrown like weapons. No dramatic confrontation. No overturned furniture. No cinematic explosion of repressed rage. Just two people in a glass office on the 37th floor, and the long, quiet aftermath of a decision made 19 years ago, settling over both of them like dust after a demolition. "I did not come here to punish you," Noel said. His voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness there was something fragile, something he had been carrying since he was old enough to understand why his birth certificate and his last name told different stories. "I came because I needed to know if you were a man I could understand. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Just understand." "And?" Malcolm asked. Noel took his time. He owed himself that. He had traveled 700 miles, spent 7 months in the orbit of a man who did not know him, carried a secret that weighed more than any 19-year-old should have to carry, all for this moment. "For this answer. You are more broken than I expected," he said. "That is not a kindness, but it is honest." 2 hours later, Isabel arrived at the building. Noel had sent a single text. "He knows. Come if you want to." She stood in the lobby for 4 full minutes before pressing the elevator button. She adjusted the strap of her bag. She looked at the elevator doors the way you look at a threshold you have spent nearly 2 decades avoiding. She was 23 again, and she was 42. She was the girl who had believed that talent and honesty would protect her in rooms full of powerful men, and she was the woman who had learned, brutally, that they would not. She was the mother who had built a fortress around her son, and was now watching him open the gate from the inside. She pressed the button. She stepped in. The elevator rose. When she walked into the office, Malcolm was standing near the window. He turned when he heard the door, and they looked at each other across the room. 19 years of silence, of separate lives built carefully, independently, in the wreckage of a single devastating season. 19 years of choices made alone in rooms where the other person was only a memory and a wound. "Isabel," he said, his voice fractured on the second syllable. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal the fault line that had been running beneath the surface of this man for longer than he had ever admitted to anyone, including himself. She did not move toward him. She did not need to. The distance between them was not measured in feet. It was measured in years and decisions and all the things that cannot be crossed by simply walking forward. "This was his choice," she said. Her voice was controlled, steady, practiced in the way that only a woman who has spent nearly 2 decades managing a pain she never asked for can be. "Not mine. I want you to understand that. He asked me to let him do this, and I let him, because I trust him. Not you. Him. I know," Malcolm said. "I know it was." She looked at Noel, standing quietly near the bookshelf. Her son, her entire world, the boy she had raised alone before Daniel came, and together with Daniel after. The boy who had inherited her determination and his father's silence, and had turned both of those things into something neither of his parents could have predicted. "You have his hands," she said softly. "I always pretended you did not." Noel looked down at his hands, then back at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The kind that carries grief and love and recognition in equal measure. The kind that says, "I know who I am now, and I am still yours." The triangle in that room, father, mother, son, held 19 years of silence between them, and in that silence, a decision was being made. Not spoken, not negotiated, just felt. Whether the silence would become a wall or a bridge depended on what came next. And what came next was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was not the kind of resolution that wraps itself in a bow and presents itself as complete. Malcolm tried. That was the part the story had to hold honestly, because it would have been simpler, cleaner, safer to say he did not. A man who refuses to change is a simple story. A man who refuses to change is a villain you can keep at arm's length, judge cleanly, and forget about by morning. But a man who tries imperfectly, uncertainly, without any guarantee that trying will be enough, that man is a complicated story. And complicated stories are the ones that stay with you. He did not issue public statements. He did not hire reputation consultants or orchestrate some carefully managed redemption arc designed to make himself the hero of a narrative he had never earned. He did what people do when they know they have forfeited the right to ask for anything. He showed up. quietly, consistently, at cost to himself, without expectation. He called Noel on weeknights, not about business, about nothing in particular, about everything in general. He sat through awkward silences that would have been unbearable to the man he had been a year ago, because he understood now that silence between a father and a son is not emptiness. It is space. Space for something to grow into if you are patient enough and honest enough to let it. He wrote Isabel a letter, not an apology designed to make himself feel absolved, not the kind of carefully worded language that benefits the person apologizing more than the person who was harmed. He wrote an accounting. I know what I took from you. I know I cannot return it. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am telling you that I see it now. All of it. The humiliation, the erasure, the years you spent rebuilding what I destroyed. I see it, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. Not because I owe it to you, though I do, because it is the truth, and I spent 19 years running from the truth. I am done running. Isabel read the letter at her kitchen table. Daniel sat across from her, his hand resting near hers, not touching, just present, in case she needed it. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the fireproof box. Next to the birth certificate, next to the old photographs, next to the dried corsage from a night she no longer spoke about but had never been able to throw away. She did not forgive Malcolm, not in the clean, tidy way that stories sometimes demand. Forgiveness like that is a fiction. Real forgiveness is not a single moment. It is a process. It is a door you open slowly over time as the person on the other side proves they will not break it again. She was not ready to open that door. She might never be, but she did something else. She put down the weight. The anger she had been carrying against her chest for 19 years, toxic and heavy, and so familiar that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. She set it down. Not for him, for herself. And in that release she found a kind of freedom she had not known she had been missing. The freedom of a woman who has decided that the man who hurt her no longer gets to define how she carries herself through the world. That was its own kind of miracle. 4 months later, Noel walked back into the Draper International Tower, not as an assistant. He had been offered a junior strategist role, competitive, vetted, earned entirely on merit, through a process that Malcolm had deliberately removed himself from to ensure there could be no question. Noel had taken 2 weeks to decide, not because he was uncertain about his ability, because he was uncertain about his heart. He appeared in Malcolm's doorway on a Monday morning, bag over one shoulder, the same quiet certainty in his posture that had been there from the very first day, the same stillness, the same steady eyes. Malcolm looked up. This time, he looked up immediately. Something moved across his face. Not quite joy, not quite relief. Something older and less nameable than either of those things. The particular expression of a man who has been given something he stopped believing he deserved, and who understands with perfect clarity the difference between receiving grace and having earned it. He had not earned this. He knew that, and knowing it made the receiving of it almost unbearable in its tenderness. I am not here because of who you are to me, Noel said. I need you to understand that. I do, Malcolm said. I am here because you are trying, because when the truth came, you did not run from it. You did not lawyer up or spin it or try to control the narrative. You sat with it. You let it cost you something, and you started showing up. He paused. Do not stop. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the same chair he had stood behind that first morning 7 months ago, when Malcolm had not looked up, when neither of them had known what was standing 3 feet away. He opened his laptop. The morning light caught the edge of the desk, the glass, the city beyond the windows, indifferent and endless and beautiful in the way that only a city seen from a great height can be. Malcolm returned to his work, and for a long while the only sound in the office was the hum of the building and the quiet rhythm of 2 people figuring out, slowly, carefully, without a manual or a map, what it means to begin. He did not get his son back. That was never something he was owed. You do not get back what you threw away. That is not how life works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What Malcolm Draper got was harder, rarer, and infinitely more fragile than restoration. He got a chance, a single, undeserved chance to become the kind of man his son could choose to know. Not a father yet. Maybe not ever, but something. A presence, a possibility, a door left open by a young man who had every right to slam it shut and chose instead to see what might walk through. And for the first time in 19 years, Malcolm Draper did not look away. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that it is never too late to try, that the people we have hurt deserve our honesty more than our apologies, that redemption is not a single moment but a daily, ongoing choice to show up and be better than the person you were yesterday, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Leave a comment and tell me what would you have done in Noel's place. Would you have walked into that building? Would you have given that man a chance? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, join us. Because this channel is built on stories like this one. Stories that remind us what it means to be human, what it costs to run from the truth, and what it gives us when we finally stop running. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. I will see you in the next one.